So we're thrilled to have Deva Woodley here with us today, who is an associate professor of politics and the director of undergraduate studies at the New School for Social Research in New York City. Probably undergrads aren't familiar with the New School for Social Research, but they've been doing sort of cutting edge, really interesting social and political philosophy. I know it just since the end of the Second World War, but maybe before that, but really a lot of the European intellectuals fleeing Europe after the Second World War, a lot of them found their home in the New School for Social Research, and they've been doing really interesting work ever since then. So Professor Woodley has a degree from the University of Virginia and 2 degrees from the University of Chicago, including her PhD. And her most recent book is called The Politics of Common Sense: How Social Movements Use Public Discourse to Change Politics and Win Acceptance. And I know that's a topic a lot of people are thinking about very actively these days. So we'll turn it over to you, Professor Woodley.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being with me today. I'm excited to talk to you, and especially for the Q&A period. That's always my favorite part of things. But let me just lay out for you kind of what my project is. I want to talk to you today specifically about political organizing, which is a political phenomenon that I think is too little studied in political science and philosophy, or political theory and philosophy. And so I want to talk to us a little bit about that. But in order to have that conversation about organizing, I have to tell you about radical Black feminist pragmatism, which is the political philosophy of the movement for Black lives, which I have been studying. And let me just tell you a little bit, and I have a forthcoming book that's called Reckoning: Black Lives Matter and the Democratic Necessity of Social Movements. So let me just tell you a little bit about how I came to be writing about this book, because I think it's helpful to sort of understand how research happens. It's not always super planned, and it's not always, the result of a kind of deductive process. In fact, for me, all of my research comes from an inductive process. And I don't know if you guys know what that means. Deduction is a form of, you're philosophers though, usually I'm dealing with politics students, so they're not necessarily keyed into these first order terms. But deduction is this form of reasoning that goes from the general to the specific, and induction is a form of reasoning that goes from the specific to the general. And my form that I use as a part of my kind of methodology of thought, but also research, is inductive. I go from the specific, the particular, the lived experience to the general, right? So my work is never about a particular thinker. It's never specifically focused on one concept, but instead I'm trying to make sense of people's lives, right? Of people's lived experiences, and trying to figure out the ways that our theoretical concepts can help illuminate those lived experiences. Okay, so when I first started working on this book, or the reason I first started working on this book, is because a social movement emerged, right, in the middle of my research process. I was actually writing another book on economic discourse that I still intend to write one day. I have already started the research for that. But in the middle of working on the book, what we talk about when we talk about the economy, Ferguson happened, right? So this was in 2014. And I found myself really following what was happening in Ferguson for a number of reasons. One, it was personally important. I'm a Black woman. I am the mother of Black children and the wife of a Black man. And it was really important to me what was happening there, the emergence of a Black liberation struggle, which really hadn't happened since the previous century, right? Since the 1960s. And I thought that even at that time, it was going to have some staying power that we really needed to pay attention to. And another reason is that I'm a scholar of social movements. My first book is on the marriage equality movement and the living wage movement. And I understood that this movement was going to be very influential and impactful. And I didn't feel like when I was looking around at other people's takes that they were understanding how profound this was going to be. But that was just a hunch. I didn't really understand the depths that the movement would bring to American politics and indeed to global politics until I started interviewing people. So that's another thing that's a little bit different about my methodology, is that although I do political theory, I always start with talking to people. I always start by interviewing people who are doing the work of social change and trying to figure out how they think about it. So as I started interviewing people, I realized that the movement for Black Lives had its own particular political philosophy. And indeed, I think it's the first political philosophy, unique political philosophy of the 21st century. And when I say that it's a unique political philosophy, I don't mean that it's like sort of, you know, invented out of whole cloth, right, out of thin air. Instead, what I mean is that it puts together a number of elements while adding some new things, right, a number of elements from earlier theories while adding some new things in a unique way, and one that is particularly suited to setting our course going forward, should we choose to accept it, yes? So let me just say a little bit about radical Black feminist pragmatism. Now, it's a little bit of a clunky term, but I use it because each of those phrases has real functional importance in understanding what is included, okay? So first, let's start with radical, okay? The political philosophy of the movement for Black Lives is radical because they are concerned with the radix, right, from the Latin, the root cause, right, root causes. It's not because of any particular policy positions that the movement holds that it's radical. It's radical because of its approach, right? It's radical because of the way that it enters political questions. Because this movement is really interested in thinking about the roots of problems. And we can kind of think about this in terms of the policy positions that the movement has staked out, right? So for example, in terms of the phrase defund police, right? And the policy that goes with that. And that means that instead of spending money on policing, the movement contends that we should instead spend money on social support and social services to make people safe. Now, the reason that they do that is not because they want to be edgy. It's not even because the movement is abolitionist, it is, but it's because they want to get to the root of the question of safety, right? They want to understand if what we want is to be safe, then how should we approach that question, right? What do we know that makes people safe? And empirically, right, from our empirical data, we understand that the safest communities are the communities in which people's basic needs are met. So if we're talking about safety, we should begin there at the radix, the root, okay? Instead of going into the conversation in the field of the given, right, that exists as it is today, okay? So that's the radical part of it. Black feminism is a American political philosophy that has deep roots with Black American political thought, right? And we can think of some of its earliest proponents as like Anna Julia Cooper in the 19th century, but it's a long tradition of Black women thinking about democracy, right? And what democracy requires. And the root, right, the basis of Black feminist theorizing is that you can't reason about justice unless you're reasoning from margin to center, right? You can't reason about justice unless you're reasoning from the point of view of those who have the least power, right? And trying to get them equal justice, okay? So Black feminism inverts the kind of reasoning process that you all have been reading about, right? When you are kind of playing the hits of liberalism and Marxism, right, for that matter, is that it doesn't start with sort of abstract concepts of the good. It doesn't start with kind of abstract constructions of institutions. It doesn't start with a kind of typology of ways to govern, okay? But instead, it starts with the question, who is the furthest from power, right? Why are they the furthest from power? What causes them to suffer, okay? It is only from thinking from that standpoint, of starting from that standpoint, that we can hope to get to justice, right? In terms of Black feminism, okay? And then the pragmatism. This part often trips people up. How can they be radical and pragmatic at the same time? This is another American political philosophy, right? American pragmatism, which you may or may not read about. If you don't read about it in this class, I suggest you do later. Some of the folks who are responsible for really thinking through or for founding this and expanding this theory of American pragmatism are William James, John Dewey, Cornel West, Richard Rorty, right, are people who have thought about American pragmatism. And this political philosophy is different than what we say when we say casually or colloquially pragmatism, right? This kind of pragmatism is not about triangulation, okay? It's not about how do we find the poles and then go down the middle. That is not the kind of pragmatism that I'm talking about. The political philosophy of American pragmatism is concerned with meaning. It is concerned with experimentation. It is concerned with iteration, and it is concerned with education, okay? And those things together create the possibilities, right, for our politics, okay? What that means is that what American pragmatists say is that we do politics because it is a field of meaning, right, that we are all participating in shaping, okay? Politics is a field of meaning that we're all participating in shaping. And when we're doing politics, what we know about what is good about it, right, is what we agree on, but also what we see works or doesn't work, okay? And further, American pragmatism says we're never going to get it right. We're not going to get it right for all time, okay? We make things better, but we can't make things perfect, all right? And that's important because this is not something that comes out of a fatalism, right, or a pessimism. It's something that contends with the nature of human beings, time, and the reality of change. Even if we were to arrange society and our institutions in such a way that most people benefited most of the time, guess what? Things are going to change. New beliefs will arise, new material factors will be put into play, new institutions and movements will spring up, and we will have to adapt, and we will have to experiment, and we will have to try again, okay? That's what pragmatism is about. So this movement has a political philosophy that has radicalism, Black feminism, and pragmatism as all integral pieces, right? About how they think about politics, how they think about justice, and how they think about how we ought to move forward, okay? This form of pragmatism, I should say, also incorporates things that have been less important in other kinds of political philosophies, namely imagination. Pragmatic imagination is hugely important to this political philosophy. And this is because since this political philosophy is both radical and pragmatic, a huge part of their practice has to be imagining, right, the world that would give the least powerful the most access to power, right? And then trying to figure out the steps to get from here to there. Okay, that's pragmatic imagination. All right, so it's not imagination, it's not imagination of a total system, right? It's not a pretension toward a kind of static universalism at all. It's really about how we do politics in the world so that we serve the least of these first. Okay? All right. This is it's kind of terrible for me because I really want to like be interacting with you in a more robust way. Okay, so that's the kind of background on radical Black feminist pragmatism. So the question then becomes, for the rest of what I'm going to say, is how does that feed into organizing? And I'm happy to tell you, although this is not, I'm going to sort of talk about this extemporaneously, but what we just saw happen in Georgia, for example, and I hope that you all were paying attention as raptly as I was, although I called it, I will say I called it. But what we just saw happen in Georgia, led out by people like Stacey Abrams and LaTosha Brown and others, is an absolute manifestation of the kind of organizing given to us by radical Black feminist pragmatism, right? And by Black feminism chiefly, right? And this comes from the legacy of Ella Baker, who's someone you may or may not have heard of, right? Who's the sort of icon of Black feminist organizing, who worked with every major group in the 20th century Black civil rights movement and advised them that we don't actually, that charismatic leaders are not the way that you build power and get justice. Instead, what's needed is the broadest possible empowered democracy, right? You get as many people involved as possible, and you teach them how to lead, right? Because most people have a capacity for leadership in their own ways and in their own domain. And so we see the sort of present day manifestation of this philosophy in our politics right now, and it has been pivotal, and it will continue to be pivotal, right, in those Senate races that are up for grabs January 5th. Okay, so well, let's say a little bit about organizing. And this part, I'm going to read to you. I hope you don't mind, and then we'll come back together and I'll answer some questions. Okay. This is an excerpt from the 4th chapter of my forthcoming book, which is called The Art of Organizing, and it begins with an epigraph. The mandate for Black people in this time is to avenge the suffering of our ancestors, to earn the respect of future generations, and to be willing to be transformed in the service of the work. This is a protest chant authored by organizer Mary Hooks of the Black Lives Matter organization, or the Movement for Black Lives organization, Southerners on New Ground. Radical Black feminist pragmatism and its key tenet, the politics of care, are illuminatingly expressed in the Movement for Black Lives approach to organizing and organization building. As I have discussed in the foregoing chapters, radical Black feminist pragmatism is fundamentally anchored by the notion that democratic politics has been diminished by the dominant emphasis on rights, procedure, and participation to the exclusion of considerations of capacity, political understanding, pragmatic imagination, public education, and political change. Organizing is the political activity that brings these less studied and less discussed political activities into focus. In this way, the Movement for Black Lives takes up the concern most closely articulated in philosophical pragmatism that, quote, the conscious adjustment of the new to the old is imagination. That's a quote from John Dewey. And that this kind of imagination is critical to political organizing. This point is critical because there can be no practicable solutions to to solving the long vexing structural and political problems without this kind of pragmatic, socially intelligent imagination and the action that it can galvanize. Political organizing, which is what leaders in social movements do, fund the capacity for political actors to recognize themselves as political subjects capable of acting, okay? And I just want to pause here and emphasize this point. Political organizing is what teaches people that politics matters, right? Not sort of from the outside as duty, but instead that they themselves are political actors, that they are political subjects capable of acting, okay? In Arendtian terms, and that is, I'm drawing here from the political philosophy of Hannah Arendt, right? In the Arendtian sense, that means creating something unexpected and new, right? To act is to create something unexpected and new. In other words, organizing is not primarily about assembling a mass of people for a political cause, which is mobilization, nor is it about turning up in defiance of authorities through protest, which is activism. Instead, organizing is fundamentally the process that allows people to be, quote, transformed in the service of the work, as Mary Hooks, a lead organizer in Southerners on New Ground, puts it. I argue that Hooks's refrain gives us a framework to understand the understudied yet unique and politically powerful phenomena that is political organizing, an activity that is distinct, as I have said, from mobilization and activism, in that its result is not to do a thing, but to become the kind of person who does what is to be done, okay? I wanna pause here again. The result is not to do a thing, but to become the kind of person who does what is to be done. This is so critically important because what's so special about political organizing is that it teaches people not only what to do in a particular situation, but it teaches them that they are capable of doing what needs to be done in any given political situation. You see how powerful that is, right? That's a fund, right? Not just for now, not only for this moment, but for any moment that comes up, because it teaches people to be the kind of political subject who can act, which is to create something new, right? To improvise, right? It's making us, it makes us into political improvisers that can be effective in many different kinds of situations, okay? All right. In this way, organizing is of critical import to democracy itself, because it is a process through which people learn what membership in a democratic polity must entail, and reminds them that they have both power and responsibility in undertaking that is self-governance, in the undertaking, which is self-governance. Okay? So what is political organizing? Political organizing is a process of meeting, engagement, education, and preparation for collective action that people undertake in the service of some public end. There are two main intellectual traditions of political organizing in America: the community-based organization, or CBO model, that was first articulated by legendary Chicago organizer Saul Alinsky, a tradition that is still carried on in CBOs today, like the Industrial Areas Foundation. And the second model is the folk school model, developed by Miles Horton and his collaborators at the Highland School of Folk, most notably Black organizer Septima Clark, who served as both the school's education director and a leader in the NAACP and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Out of these traditions, the Movement for Black Lives has crafted its own unique approach, steeped in radical Black feminist pragmatism, and recently codified by organizer Charlene Carruthers, who is the former director of the Black Youth Project 100, a Chicago-based movement organization. It is important to clarify what organizing is by being clear about what it is not. Organizing is distinct from both activism and mobilization. Activism is chiefly characterized by the activity of protest. It need not include the analysis of power, cultivation of leadership, or plans for further or future action. Mobilization, on the other hand, is the assembly of people who already have requisite understanding and skill for the completion of a task, right? So mobilization is when you ask people to just to get out there and vote, right? And they're already registered and they have already voted before. You're just reminding them to do it, right? People are mobilized when they have previous education experience or training for the task at hand. One mobilizes soldiers to be deployed or registered voters to show up at the polls. Political mobilization has often been explored as though it is synonymous with organizing in the literature of political science. But individuals who have not been either socialized in early life or organized into politics cannot be mobilized. They must first undergo a process of engagement and education that shifts their understanding of a public problem or cause, and most importantly, their understanding of their ability to affect it, okay? Regardless of the tradition they come out of, organizers prepare people to relate, understand, and act. Therefore, the first activity of organizing is to develop interpersonal and sound relationships that can serve as the basis for social engagement, political education, and collective action. The way those relationships are constructed will vary, but most organizers agree that there can be no engagement, education, and activation of people toward public action without finding ways to relate under reciprocal conditions of trust and support. The kinds of relationships that organizers aim to establish resemble the political friendship that Aristotle detailed in The Politics. This consists of goodwill animated and directed by common purpose. In addition to cultivating political friendship, organizers seek to develop into leaders some of the people that they meet and establish political friendship with. Leaders, in this sense, are organizers who are responsible for helping to bring more people into the particular understanding of the world and events subscribed to by the organization or movement, okay? I want to pause here and be really clear. Leaders are not only bringing people into an organization, although they might. They are more importantly bringing people into a particular political understanding of the world, okay? So that may mean that they join your organization. Maybe they don't join your organization. They just come to understand something like the difference between Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter as slogans, for example, okay? So this is about building organizations, but it's also about political communication, okay? All right, leaders are also tasked with action, that is, initiating new relationships of political friendship, gathering resources, and executing public plans. Charlene Carruthers of BYP 100 indicates that one of the key responsibilities of leaders is to tell what she calls complete stories that help people hold the contradictions of our histories together in order to make more informed and strategic decisions as a movement. Michael Gecken, who's associated with the Alinsky-style Industrial Areas Foundation, describes leaders as people who are able to quote, use a combination of power, pressure, and patience to create the conditions that make new things possible and make it possible to take action. These activities of cultivating broad understanding and planning and executing public actions are key tasks of leadership in the context of political friendship. Okay, just one more thing I want to talk about, which is action. So then the question remains, what does it mean to take action and to act effectively? Organizers take a broadly Arendtian view of action. That is to say that action for an organizer is not just the activity of protest, but is also the process by which those who are in a relation of political friendship work together to make claims, develop their means and capacity, and secure their ends. For Arendt, activity is judged to be action when, quote, it discloses the identity of the agent, affirms the reality of the world, and actualizes our capacity for freedom. I'll read that again. For Arendt, activity is judged to be action, okay? Activity is just doing stuff, okay? But action is when we, quote, disclose the identity of the agent, affirm the reality of the world, and actualize our capacity for freedom. The action we take shows who we are, what we understand, and what we are willing to do, to author and imagine, to change, and to change things in order to bring those things into alignment with the world we share, okay? So action shows who we are, what we understand, and what we are willing to do to be authors of change and to bring those things that we have come to understand into alignment with the world that we share. We exhibit our capacity for freedom not by making choices between given alternatives, nor merely through the exercise of our will, but instead by utilizing our natal ability to begin. Arendt writes, quote, it is in the nature of beginning that something new is started, which cannot be expected from whatever may have happened before. This character of startling unexpectedness is inherent in all beginnings. The fact that man is capable of action means that the unexpected can be expected from him, that he is able to perform what is infinitely improbable. Action, then, is what Lorelei Praley, who's the president of Community Change Action, one of the groups associated with movement, calls the art of the possible. Okay, so action is the art of the possible. Praley explains, and this is a sort of drop quote, I came into this work because I was undocumented and I was afraid and I was ashamed and I lived with a tremendous amount of fear. And before I understood that there was a policy fight that needed to be had and needed to be won, I needed to go through my own liberation and my own transformation. And that's why policy alone is not possible. I'm going to read that again. And that's why policy alone is not possible. That's why policy fights alone are not enough, because doing the movement building, the deep organizing work on the ground, and having that be felt in DC, and driving and shaping our national politics is about what really moves someone from a state of hopelessness into a state of hope and power and fearlessness and possibility. And so I believe that organizing is the art of the possible. Okay? And that's all I want to say. Now I'm ready for your questions.
Wow, thank you so much for that. I mean, so I also work on Arendt, and I was so happy to hear you talk about her and the connection to political organizing, and particularly thinking about it in light of the events of last week, of course, and longer term over the last few years. Was really, really illuminating. So thank you so much for that.
You're welcome. I should say, just as a kind of philosophical point, my reading of Arendt is a kind of Jungian, like Iris Marion Young reading of her, because Arendt actually thinks that we're kind of born with born with the kind of activity, like the capacity for action that we're going to have, whereas Jung describes us as doers and actors who develop, right, capacity during our life. So I have a more kind of social process than Arendt really talks about. But yeah, I'm a big Arendtian too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you so much for that. So the floor is open for questions. I know it always takes people a few minutes to like wrap their heads around exactly what they want to say. So if anyone would like to be brave and try to articulate a question, feel free. If not, I'll ask if any of the professors who are here would like to ask a question to get us started. I see Professor Damas is here, Professor Lee Straunt is here. Okay, great. So I'm actually seeing some hands from students. So I'll go through the hands as they appear. So the first question is from Adam.
Hey, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I personally support the Black Lives Matter movement. However, I have friends who don't to an extent. And whenever I have this debate with people, it seems like they're not necessarily like disagreeing with like the slogan or the phrase, but they're disagreeing with some of the tactics that like supporters of the movement are using. And I was wondering if you had any, not suggestions, but kind of any ideas on how Black Lives Matter and like the movement as a whole might change some of the tactics to kind of get these kind of people on board, or if you think that's even necessary.
Well, I mean, I think that the movement already has a majority of people on board, right? So in terms of tactics, I think that in the movement itself approves tactics that most people agree with, right? But when you have massive demonstrations, like for example, over the summer, 26 million people at least came into the streets to protest. And during that time, some people do things that the movement absolutely doesn't control, right? However, that doesn't cancel out the movement's sort of push on ideas. And so I think that that's the approach to take with people who are concerned with tactics, which is to say that, you know, mass movements have people who kind of just show up. Like if you do anything, right, you throw a party, right, and it gets too big, people start to do things that you didn't say they could do, right? And that's not the root of what the movement is pushing for, and to instead pay attention to you know, what the movement wants, right? The policies that it wants, and to think those things through. And that if, you know, a few fires or something like this, right, will cause someone to turn away from defending Black lives from, you know, murder, then that's probably a priority problem.
I always wondered if that was a way of deflecting from the radicalness of the movement, to say, oh, look at the fires they're doing. We can't tolerate that. Like, we have to have perfect civility before we're willing to accept any change.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, I always sort of just yes, I think that it absolutely is a deflection tactic. It's also a kind of misremembering, or like hagiography of the 20th century civil rights movement, as though it was all totally peaceful. Like there were riots, like, you know, huge fires, right? You know, murders, conflict. Like we tend to misremember the 20th century civil rights movement as like entirely peaceful because it had a doctrine of nonviolence, but it also was not peaceful, and it also, you know, left many bodies on the ground, blood in the streets, and things burned out, you know. that didn't originate from the movement, right? That wasn't the strategy of the movement, but whenever you have contentious politics, things like that will happen. The question, I think, becomes, what side are you on, right? Like, what kind of world do you want to live in? Does the argument of the movement resonate with you? Do you see yourself inside the idea that we should live in a world in which Black people and all people can live and thrive and not be subject to the summary assassination on the street by agents of the state?
Thank you. Sharon.
I don't know if you guys can hear me very well. I'm outside, but I just wanted to ask, you talked about political organizing being a means to like teach people to be active without using the idea of like it's your duty to be active. And then you also talked about like how action is the art of teaching people or compelling people to be a part of action. So like how are these two ideas distinct, I guess? How do you compel people to do something without making them think it's their duty to be a part of something bigger?
Well, you don't organizing is not about compulsion. You're not compelling anyone, right? Instead, you're creating relationships. Organizing is all about building relationships, right? So for example, the political organizing that has taken place in Georgia recently, and I should say that I grew up north of Atlanta, so I'm particularly interested in this, has taken place over a 10-year period, right? Stacey Abrams had a 10-year plan when she was the Democratic Speaker of the State House, right, of how to turn Georgia blue. So it's not about compulsion at all, right? It's instead about getting out into communities, having people who are already doing political work in various different communities and building political relationships around what people want and need, right? It's about asking people what they want and need. It's not about telling them what they need to do, right? And then it's about creating the resources and the capacity so that people can do the work for themselves, right? That's how you end up organizing people so that they have the capacity to be mobilized, right? In a moment, mobilized for election, mobilized for an election, mobilized to get resources together, mobilized to show up in a particular place, right? First, you have to have the relationships where you have been in communities for months and years saying, what is it that you most want to change about where you are right now? What is it that you need to make this neighborhood safer? Do you need us, what is it that you want in terms of childcare, healthcare, do you need a stop sign on this road, right? Like, things like this. It's very, very local. And what you do is you create relationships with people and help people to get what they want and need according to them, right? Not according to some outside person, but according to them, and say, and it's through that process that people become used to the idea that they actually can make change. Because the truth is, national elections, while they're very, important, are not actually the thing that has the most immediate and direct impact on people's lives, right? It's local stuff. It's the city council, it's the school board, it's the, parks and recreation, right? And those are actually the things that people can affect most immediately as well. Right? So when you have an organizing campaign that's about the local school board, for example, and people decide to recruit, local people in their area, right? People from their churches, people from their, clubs, people from their neighborhoods to run for something, right? For example, the school board, the city council, whatever, because those people have good ideas about how to serve that particular area, and people run those kind of campaigns and they win, that teaches them they can win, right? It teaches them that they can win things that they can touch and feel and that impact their lives. And that makes people want to do it more. I mean, honestly, that's what it is, right? Like people are like, oh, I actually can change things. And now I want to change some more things, right? And that's what political organizing is.
Okay, thank you. Tobias.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. If I were to want to start with a group of friends, sort of an intentional community, with the goal of essentially learning how to organize and then teaching others how to organize, where would you say start, like in terms of the literature? What do you think would be good things to read?
Well, I would say you shouldn't read the literature. I would say you should join a local organization, because I guarantee you there's already orgs doing this kind of work. And so the best way to learn organizing is from people who are organized, right? And then if you want to start another organization down the road, then that's fine. But there are people who are already doing this work in almost every community in America. And part of what I want to do, this is a kind of an aside, but I've just recently started an initiative on power politics and organizing. And part of what I want to do is to map this activity, because we know too little about it, right? We know too little about it, even though it's going on everywhere. So I would say, first, join a local organization. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to start from scratch. There are people doing this work. And we learn from those.
I think Professor Woodley is frozen. Oh,
I'm back. Did you hear me?
No, we missed maybe the last minute.
Oh no. Well, it was the same as the last part. Join a local organization. That's how you become a leader, right? You become a leader by sort of learning the work and the ropes, and then you can spread the faith in whatever way is best suited for you.
I feel like just to ask a follow-up on that, for those of us who are sitting in university classrooms thinking about like what role our university education can play, it seems like, okay, we organize, we do the practice, but what role do you think education, like sort of college level, reading Locke and Marx, and what if any role do you think this can play in these strategies around organizing and then, to further the goals of the movement for Black lives?
Well, I think we could teach more about organizing, which is not Locke and is not Marx,
Yeah.
as much as I quite like them both. But is instead reading Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, and instead is reading Miles Horton on the Highlander Folk School. The truth is that and reading Ella Baker, right, and reading about Flo Kennedy, right? So these are, the thing about organizers is that they actually don't have a huge kind of political philosophic literature. Most of the stuff that they have written has been like manuals, like, and so one of the things that I hope that we do in the Academy, and that I certainly have begun trying to do with my initiative, is to integrate what we have sort of historically from those folks into a political analysis, right? So that it's easier to teach. But that's I think our goal is to really think about organizing as a political philosophy, a philosophic phenomena, and to theorize it, right? From the writings that we have and the activities of people who are doing it.
Sure. Thank you. Professor Delmas.
Thanks. Much for this talk. Really enjoy it, find it fascinating. And I have more than one question, I have to say, so I'll be quick. But the first one is, why do you think there's been this relativeness, even in political theory, but especially in philosophy, about organizing, and why similarly the public seems to never think about it and see it as, it's a kind of invisible work, and that's visible in part in like the reaction to the elections, right, where what we're already seeing is blaming Black Lives Matter for their radicalism instead of thanking them for all the grassroots organizing they've been doing. That's first. And well, we've seen since President Obama a lot of organizing on the right with the and other current, lockdown rebellion, the pro-Trump and anti-public health measures protests, and so on. And so I wonder whether you also have something to say about that. And I mean, so, the grassroots are going to be interested here with the astroturfing, the fact that it's a lot of big mega donors from the Republican side who are funding those. But I wonder whether you see some sort of nefarious transformation of the air to the the virtuous one that's happening on the democratic organizing side. And lastly, so the art of organizing, that is Black Lives Matter movement, is the art of democratic organizing. And so there is this organic connection movement's aim of creating a more just, more inclusive society that informs the organizing. And so the question is whether there's also an organic connection, the tactics and strategies on the ground that are to be chosen. Thanks.
Okay, I didn't get all of the last question. I didn't get the question part of the last question.
Did I break up? Sorry. So
yes.
The question is whether there's also an organic connection between organized modalitism, so the strategies and tactics to be resorted to on the ground to realize the goal of the movement.
Okay. Yes. So that
makes sense.
That seems like a comment, but that's right. I agree with you. Is that right?
It was, is there such organic connection?
Yes. There is. That was easy. I'll do that one first. There is an organic connection. So yes, that's true. For the first two questions, in terms of why has philosophy and political theory ignored organizing, is because philosophy particularly, but political theory also, is set up for deduction and not induction, right? I mean, that's the basic line. Organizing doesn't have, it's not structured the way that Western philosophy is. It doesn't have a kind of big overarching concept that you then invent imaginary sort of institutions to fill, right? Or that you sort of then put values underneath to sort of explain the big overarching concept. Organizing is deductive, right? Organizing starts with the particular and says that this is an improvisational process that you have to go through at length, right? So it has it is a political, we can theorize about it, but it has a sociological form. It really doesn't have a philosophical form, at least as far as Western philosophy goes. So people have kind of ignored it. Also, organizers tend not to be philosophers, right? Like tend not to sort of like write books about the work that they do, which is, it's something that there are some folks in movement who are trying to change. So for example, Charlene Carruthers is like very committed to this notion that the people who are doing the work should write the books, right? Like stop and write, you have to do this. But the truth is that organizers are almost always working. So they usually actually are not writing books. So we lose a lot of knowledge that way, basically. And academics haven't paid enough attention to them yet, although that's changing, right? Although that's changing. And that's part of what I'm hoping to do, is to codify some of this so that we have a permanent, memory, intellectual memory, right? That it becomes a part of intellectual history instead of practice-based. Because while I'm all about praxis, practice is ephemeral, right? Like we do the thing and the thing has an impact, but in order to have a kind of permanent memory of it, we have to write it down, right? We have to write it down. And then in terms of organizing on the right wing, organizing is just organizing. It doesn't matter if you're doing it on the right, left, center, it doesn't matter. It's a process, right? And this is where the American pragmatism comes in too. Organizing is not normative in terms of like this thing is organizing, so it's good, right? It's just the name of a process. And you're right, the right wing has been very good at organizing. That's partly because they have, religion and religiosity has been associated with right-wing politics since the 1950s, right? And so they have an institution that's basically built right, to create relationships of reciprocity between people, right, where they unite for a common cause. So it's like a perfect organizing like incubator. And so unfortunately, right, the left kind of ceded that ground in the 1970s. So we don't, and at the same time that all the sort of Robert Putnam stuff was happening in terms of the diminishment of all of our sort of civic and public education, you know, and all of our time being being colonized by waged work. So people who were not religious had fewer and fewer opportunities to meet and develop political friendships because more and more of our time was being demanded by waged work. And so the right wing had a corner on organizing for a long time, basically because they took the church, they took the churches.
Thank you. Aaron.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, my camera's not working today, so
That's okay.
that's why it's off. So I read a book, I think it was by Leslie Crutchfield, and she was talking about how like successful social movements were, like how they were successful in the past and what we need to like learn from them. And her three main points were that they need to have local chapters, like all across the country, that they need to have like a strong national hierarchy that goes all the way down to those local chapters, and that they need to have influence on elections. And I was just curious how true you thought that was, if you thought it was true, where the Black Lives Matter movement is in that process, and the role of like hierarchy in the Black Lives Matter movement.
No, I completely disagree with the hierarchy point. I think that movements definitely do need to have a kind of widespread, broad base. But having a widespread, broad base and coordination is not necessarily associated with hierarchy. And hierarchy can actually be detrimental to movements because a hierarchical movement can be decapitated. And what I mean is that if you have a single leader or even a cadre of leaders, right, at the top, if those people are discredited, if those people are co-opted, if those people are taken off the political scene for whatever reason, then the entire movement will suffer, yeah? Now this is not always the case with long-standing institutions. So long-standing institutions, like the ones embedded in sort of democratic society, can handle a leader, right, being taken off the field because the institution exists and it's old and it's deep and it exists for itself, right? It has those kind of Weberian tendencies of inertia. But social movements are not that old, right? And they are not that institutionally rooted. And so having a single charismatic leaders is always dangerous for social movements. Now, the reason that people think that hierarchy is important is because they think that hierarchy is needed in order to have a stable organization capable of widespread coordination. And you do need widespread coordination, right? So, you know, that's the plus side, right, to a hierarchical organization, is that you can have like widespread coordination. But the Movement for Black Lives has designed an organization that's federated, right? Like that's semi-federated basically, which is that the Movement for Black Lives, which is the umbrella organization, doesn't have a hierarchy, right? There's no president of the Movement for Black Lives or whatever. Instead, it has a table structure, which is to say that representatives from autonomous organizations that are local, so for example, Southerners on New Ground, BYP 100, Black Lives Matter Global Network over in Oakland, Assata's Daughters in New York, Dream Defenders in Florida, they're all autonomous. They all do their own thing in their own place, but they come together under the banner of the Movement for Black Lives in tables that are organized around expertise. So you have the organizing table, you have the media and communications table, you have the resources table, you have, the policy table, right? Like, and representatives from these different autonomous organizations come together and meet and coordinate what they need to coordinate for the national kind of campaigns or the national reach that they want to do, okay? And then they go back to their own organizations, right? So there's no boss telling people what to do. Instead, they get together based on different kinds of expertise and they coordinate their activities to the extent that they need to be coordinated to make their goals, right? Now that's not a conflict-free process, right? Like not everybody agrees, but that gives them the pluses of a large coordinating apparatus, which you do need, without the minuses of a hierarchical organization.
Interesting, thank you. Kevin.
Hi, thank you. So I really liked what you had to say about organizing, especially in relation to Georgia and what's happened there this year. You mentioned that Stacey Abrams, working in government, devised this 10-year plan to turn the state blue. And I know that she did a lot of awareness about things like voter suppression and registration using her platform running for governor.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, and I don't know how well this could be answered since this is all recent and it hasn't really, I don't know if it's been thoroughly studied yet, but how important is a figure working from the inside being kind of like the figurehead of organizing, like a figure like Stacey Abrams, to turning a state like Georgia blue and mobilizing and organizing a lot of people there? And then going back to your last response, are there dangers in a figure like her becoming kind of the face of the organization that we're seeing in Georgia?
Yes, there are dangers, which is part of the reason that every time Stacey Abrams is interviewed, she says that she hasn't done it by herself, and it's actually not only Stacey Abrams, it's LaTosha Brown, who runs Black Voters Matter, and it is a whole cadre of people who are doing the work. With the case of Abrams and Georgia, you have two different strategies kind of colliding. So you have the Black feminist strategy that Abrams is pushing, which is one that is about a broad-based coalition of people doing all kinds of work, right? Doing all the work that needs to be done to push from all sides. And you have dominant sort of US culture, which wants to know who the celebrity is, right? So there's a tension there that's always kind of being pushed, right, and pushed back on. But if you follow these things on social media, and this is the way the movement has been since the beginning, by the way, you'll see pushback, right? You'll see pushback of like everybody going, Stacey, Stacey, Stacey. And then everybody, including Stacey Abrams, going, it's not just me, right? It's not just me, it's all these other people, right? Follow all these other people, right? Bring them up, give them shine, give them glow. It's like, it's the popular, anyway, I was going to make a pop culture reference, but I'm not going to do it anyway. I'm not going to do it now. But the point is that there's a tension there, right? Is that our politics wants to have a figurehead, right? And organizing in the Black feminist tradition doesn't want to have a figurehead. So there's always that kind of push and pull, this back and forth. But what you'll see happening in the coming days is that Stacey Abrams will retain her star, she'll retain her shine, but you will also see other people coming along with her, right? I mean, that's how we do.
It's almost like the opposite of a cult of personality kind of leadership style.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So I'm gonna have a question from Professor, and then we'll come back to the student questions. So Professor Lee Strange.
Hi, thank you for that talk. I learned a lot, and I have sorry, there's a baby in the background crying. Just a second.
That's okay. I have two who are gonna walk through the door anytime.
So my question is just is about the role of organizing. I guess it's more of an invitation to comments about the role of organizing when political friendship is lacking, as it seems to be in this country. I'm from a country where voting is compulsory and there's fairly robust assurance, like infrastructure for ensuring that everybody can vote. And I'm shocked that there's such an effort at voter suppression here. It seems beyond the pale. So I guess from what little I understand of the organizing here, it's that there's those who maybe can be brought on board who don't already have opposition to say, enfranchisement, voting enfranchisement, and so on. But then there seems to be others who are in some way principally opposed to it, or at least maybe they're under mistaken assumptions about the extent of voter fraud. I can't even really imagine what the justifications are. But so I guess so this invitation to comment is really just how does one sort of situate organizing in this sort of divided context where you can certainly bring a lot of people on board, but you're still going to have others who seem to be not cooperating to a unified purpose of, say, democratic enfranchisement. That's my comment. Thank you.
Well, I'll say to you what Yvette Simpson, who is another Black woman who has bbeen working in Georgia and all around the South, has said, is that, and she works for, what's the organization? Democratic Action for America, I think, DFA. But what she says is that unity is good, but freedom is better. Right? So that means that the political friendship that I'm talking about is not about making friends with people who support Donald Trump. That's not an issue, right? The political friendship I'm talking about is between people who want justice and equity and are engaged in the political process, and people who would want those things if they were engaged in the political process, right? It's about the disengaged and those, sort of who are already sort of fighting for justice. That's the one thing. But the other thing is that, in terms of voter suppression and, that has to do with the US history of white supremacy and racism. I mean, that's just the answer to that question. It's not complicated, to be honest with you. It's about ensuring the franchise for those who are included in the notion of the people that preserve white supremacist patriarchy, and excluding those who don't.
Sorry, could I have a follow-up?
Sure.
Just super quick. Thanks. Great. So as someone who was, that's very helpful. As someone who was brought up on the hits, I was thinking of, as we were sort of speaking, of the sort of what's left out of the hits. Like when I think of roles next week, like kind of reasonable pluralism and, senses of, like he talks a lot about assuming there's already a common ground there, and then what do you do once everyone has these sort of shared beliefs background beliefs about what justice requires, or so on. Whereas the sort of the tradition that you're working out of sounds like it's saying, what if we're not in that space?
Yeah, we're 100% not in that space. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was just a comment on trying to maybe sew together or locate the two different, where these two might meet, which is somewhere in this sort of situation where, I guess, working from the outside, as you put it in, and once you've got people who are enfranchised and able to meaningfully take part, then you can do the grand theorizing, and maybe maybe that's just me extending it beyond what you're saying there. Anyway, that was just helpful for me to get my own ideas on out there.
Well, and there are touch points. I mean, you can't make Rawls identical to this political philosophy, obviously, but there are touch points, right? Like, so if you think about, and I have a secret hope that some Rawlsian will do this one day. If you think about the difference principle, right? But put inside that space of the difference principle an ethic, right? Or a value of margin to center justice, you can almost get there. Yeah. So if you make a decision rule, right, inside, right, like behind the veil, although this, I should say, there is no veil, right? Like there's nothing like that in this theory, right? There's no sort of Archimedean point outside of time. Like it doesn't start, the places that Western political philosophy usually starts, right? There's no kind of, imaginary beginning of the state of nature. There is no behind the veil, right? There's nothing. We are in the world, right? That's what makes it pragmatic. But if you wanted to sort of think about how one could sort of get almost to this place, I really do think that if you, are with Rawls and you put margin to center ethic, behind the veil, then you almost get there. So, yeah.
I probably won't be qualified to write that, but I hope someone is.
I hope someone is too.
Those of you in economic justice, just file that away. They'll all make sense.
No, I'm sorry. Yeah.
We're going to be talking about Rawls and the veil of ignorance soon.
Yeah.
Justin, you've been waiting patiently to ask a question, please.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for the talk. I just had a quick question regarding, I guess, what we could do as students at this moment in time.
Yeah.
Especially, because we are going through unprecedented times due to COVID and things like that.
Yeah.
I don't know, personally, I found it a bit harder to be actually involved in grassroots local organizations and actually visiting them and taking part in, marches and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Social distancing and all, especially, the curfew and everything. So if that's not possible, if in person, on the ground support is not possible as students, what are other ways that we could, aid these organizations that, need support, that need participation, especially, sort of in a local sense, because we are in Boston after all.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say be online. I mean, there's a ton of really good organizations in Boston. Like Judicial Watch is one, MA, there's one that I follow. And these organizations have social media presences, especially on Twitter and Instagram and probably others that I don't do, right? Like the ones for young people, like Twitch and whatever else is there, TikTok. Follow those things, and they will make asks. They will inform you how to participate and what they need. And that's a really good way to get involved.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So economic justice finishes about now, so I know some of you have to peel off and go do other things. If anyone wants to stick around and ask a follow-up question, I believe Professor Woodley can stay for a few extra minutes. So those of you who have to go, thank you very much for coming, and let's thank our speaker for a terrific presentation and a really interesting set of ideas to leave us with and discussion.
Nice to see you all.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Okay.
And we're left with a couple of people.
Okay. I can't stay too long, but if there's one more question, be okay.
Sophia, Lindsay, anyone? Do you have a question?
Are there any particular organizations in Boston that you would especially recommend? You mentioned Judicial Watch MA. Are there any others?
Not off the top of my head, because I am not deeply ensconced in that area. Judicial Watch MA is just one that I'm particularly interested in, because I'm just interested in that phenomena of Judicial Watch. But there's a ton of organizations, and if you'll find that, for example, you can kind of do this as a research project almost, like on Twitter, you'll find that when you go to organizations, they'll refer to other organizations, right? And you kind of like can sort of follow the breadcrumbs, right, to wherever you kind of want to go. There's some, I don't know the name of this organization, but there's like a really amazing group that deals with like hunger, like local, like food security in Boston. I can't remember the name of that group, but they are also really cool and interesting. And I learned about them when I was visiting Harvard this past year. So there's a ton of stuff, but you kind of have to do the research, but you can do that via social media pretty easily.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Well, let me just take another opportunity to thank you again. I mean, I certainly learned a lot, and it's been great to think about these in the current context as well. And
Awesome.
I can't wait to read your stuff, both on the economy and your other book that you mentioned.